Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. Another wind of change has begun to blow in a different direction. It began in June 2022 at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda, when King Charles III, speaking on behalf of his now late mother, expressed his commitment to deepening his own understanding of slavery's impact in, as he says, acknowledging our past. Since making his speech, the monarch has given permission for an investigation to be made into the British royal family's connection with the slave trade, and also granted access to the royal collection and royal archives. This certainly takes the focus of the narrative away from questions such as how wealthy are the royal family, what are they really worth, and what do they actually own, and places it firmly on questions such as to what extent did they benefit from the slave trade, and how are they still benefiting from the legacy of the slave trade today? These questions have changed the direction of the wind to blow upon the extensive history of successive British monarchs and Britain's global activities, from John Hawkins' first trip to the West African coast in 1562 to its evolution over the next 3 centuries, from independent trading corporations to crown colonies to sovereign states, Commonwealth nations and republics. So why now? As with Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's speech in 1960, Britain understands the power of the written and spoken word, as well as the importance of timing, and has always been in tune with the need for change. We could be cynical and just write it off as yet another episode in political correctness, of growing trends in private corporations who profited from slavery, involved in the reparations debate, or the monarchy debate as to whether it should remain as it is, be abolished, or change its form and structure and be slimmed down. Either way, King Charles's acknowledgement and support for further research could go some way to ease this disquieting discord. We know that, as a man, the new monarch has a deep conscience for significant issues that he cares passionately about and has taken an active part in being vocal about them. But for how long has he been carrying this particular issue in the recesses of his mind? Is this how he will make his mark upon the monarchy? Is this the legacy that he will leave behind? Is this the foreknowledge that I spoke about in my open letter to the monarch in a previous episode, that has translated into foresight of understanding that the wider context for the monarchy's position in British society, Commonwealth, and the world needs to change? Is this an individual who is the embodiment of an institution trying to come clean, absolving itself in recognising that slavery has formed part of the foundations for its wealth? What is the Cost of the Crown is a series being published by the Guardian newspaper ahead of the King's coronation on the 6th of May. It is an investigation seeking to clarify and uncover over 3 centuries of secrecy into the finances of the British royal family, how they are funded and profited from their public roles, and the varied origins of their wealth. The series may very well be the beginning of collaborations between historians, other key figures, as well as wider communities, both local, national and international, and is funded and sponsored by historic royal palaces. The research is due to be published in 2026. So where does the royal family acquire its income? The monarchy does not pay any inheritance tax due to a negotiation between the Crown and government in 1993. However, their spending is audited by the National Audit Office. Their income is mainly from the sovereign grant. The Duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster, together with other assets, trusts, private investments, and a parliamentary annuity. Historically, the sovereign grant, formerly known as the Civil List, was established in 1760 when George III gave up the hereditary revenue of the Crown, set up as a trust fund as a sole corporation, placing it at the disposal of the House of Commons in return for regular payments through what we now know as the sovereign grant. In this way, the sovereign grant has been classified as public funds and therefore used to finance the royal family. So, historians point to at least a dozen monarchs who played a central role to the slave trade. Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, sponsored John Hawkins' second trip to the West African coast in 1564, in exchange for a share in the profits from the capture of more than 600 Africans, as well as cargo treasure captured from many Portuguese ships. Her cousin, James I, 1603 to 25, consented to the forming of the Guinea Company, a group of merchants who monopolised trade with Africa, providing enslaved Africans for tobacco plantations in the newly formed American colony of Virginia. As Britain developed more colonies across the Atlantic, with Barbados being the first classed as a black slave colony in 1636, the trend of granting monopoly licences began to grow and continue with James's son, Charles I, 1625 to 49, who relicensed the Guinea Company. After the execution of Charles and the abolition of the English monarchy came the Navigation Acts, 1660 to 1663, during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. These were key pieces of legislation. Why? The Acts of Trade and Navigation, as they were collectively known, began from 1651 and became a series of laws which sought to regulate all shipping and trade activities by other European powers within and across England's growing number of colonies, and required all goods and produce from its colonies to be transported in English sea vessels. So even though the Cromwellian era has often been discounted as a crown period, the practices enabled the slave trade and everything it supported. Nothing had been reversed or undone. There was still plenty of colonial activity which continued to establish ties with the Caribbean, America and Ireland, all of which enabled future monarchs as well as merchants to continue to profit from the slave trade once the monarchy had been restored in 1660 with Charles II, 1660 to 85, who, through founding the Royal African Company in 1672, invested heavily, making the slave trade a state-sponsored enterprise. This company transported more Africans than any other company in history and made England the lead global investor in the slave trade. Charles's brother, James II, 1685 to 88, was actually governor of the Royal African Company and its largest shareholder. But despite being deposed by William III, (1689 to 1702), and Mary II, (1689 to 1694), the slave trade continued to thrive and England's profits continued to expand under their watch. The monarchs received substantial shares in the Royal African Company by the Deputy Governor at the time, a man by the name of Edward Colston. And the Bank of England was founded in 1694, providing huge loans to merchants to finance their trading exploits. William and Mary's sister and sister-in-law, Anne, 1702 to 14, oversaw the unification of England and Scotland to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And not only did Anne's reign see the rise of a new class of Scottish merchants becoming a new bourgeoisie, particularly in Glasgow, but she also secured the Ascencio de Negros, fulfilled by the South Sea Company in 1713, a potentially lucrative contract to supply Spanish colonies with nearly 5,000 African males every year. With the ascension of George I, 1714 to 27, came the rise and fall of shares which culminated in the economic catastrophe that burst the South Sea bubble of investment that his predecessor established with Spain. However, his son, George II, inherited his father's shares and was the last monarch who actively participated in war and conflict at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743 in Germany against the French. As the Industrial Revolution developed, Britain's empire began to expand with the battles of Arcot, 1751, and Plassey in 1757, placing key locations such as the Bengal and Madras under British control, as well as the capture of Quebec in 1759, which also secured the lucrative Canadian fish and fur trades. By the time his grandson, George III, 1760 to 1820, and his great-grandson, George IV, 1820 to 30, ascended to the throne, protests against the slave trade and demands for emancipation grew steadily until the abolition movement achieved its aims in 1807 with the abolition of the slave trade, and in William IV's reign, 1830 to 1837, the abolition of slavery throughout Britain's empire. However, these last three monarchs can be viewed with mixed perspectives, as George III secretly harboured disapprovals about slavery. George IV opposed and brutally crushed several slave rebellions, and his brother, before he became king, openly supported it in Parliament, claiming that slavery was central to Britain's political standing and prosperity across the globe. With the end of slavery in 1807 and 1833, one may like to assume that the royal family's profiteering from the slave trade stopped at this point, but the empire continued to expand dramatically during the reign of Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901. With the title Empress of India bestowed upon her by British PM Benjamin Disraeli and then extended to her successors until India's independence in 1947, to what extent has the royal family continued to benefit from the infrastructure left behind Britain's former colonies, and now within the post-colonial era, as 14 of those former colonies, the current monarch Charles III still remains a sovereign head of state. And so it is with King Charles that we come full circle back to the beginning of this podcast episode. As the research and investigations continue, who knows what other revelations it may uncover and add to the long list of who also profited. So, who also profited? Slave ship owners, British slave traders, plantation owners who returned to the UK, bought peerages and seats in Parliament, and also built large estates and funded inventions and industries. Who also profited? Bankers who profited from the interests and loans issued through the formation of the Bank of England and the ports of London, and later on Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow for shipbuilding. Who also profited? The factory owners in the UK, particularly with reference to the textile industries which developed in places such as Manchester and Glasgow, where these textiles were shipped out to Africa and the West Indies. Who also profited? More controversially, West African leaders and others who bought shares in slave ships and used slave labour to make certain luxuries, such as sugar, more affordable. But what about the ordinary British citizen? You and me. Are there ways in which we have also profited, or rather been the beneficiaries of slavery and the slave trade? It is a foreign and unusual perspective to have if you have never led a life of privilege, regardless of whether you are a person of colour or not. However, there are cause and effects within the microsphere of the slave trade and colonialism which the few have profited from that must have trickled down into the macrosphere of all of our daily lives. Will the investigation uncover far more than what we bargained for? And are we ready to understand perhaps other ways that we are all interconnected and embrace this brave new world? As one academic reflected over the significance of King Charles's decision, they cited that there is the hope that this will encourage a deeper reflection on the role that enslavement has played in establishing the building blocks of the structural racism that we witness and experience to this present day. Can true reparations be, then, in the dismantling of this structural racial hierarchy, the realisation and reality of stable political power and economic growth within former colonies, and the end of judgments about where you come from and who you are purely based on the tone of your skin? If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform and check out my other podcast episodes related to this one, such as What Do We Know About Edward Colston from the first season, From Trash to Treasure, the Scottish Darien Project from the second season, and An Open Letter to King Charles III from this, the current third season. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They are all available on the website in both Kindle and paperback formats. And also the publication of the latest 4 titles. If you want to know more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. My newsletter for the month of April is also out, and you can find the link in the notes of this podcast. As for our April promotion, it's a copy of Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, in celebration of another year of independence for Zimbabwe, and we also remember other former colonies who also have Independence Days in April. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of any one of my poetic narratives, the link is also in the show notes. Now, if you're not a part of the email list, visit storiestobetold.com and sign up, where you can opt in and receive your free samples of my first 4 titles. And it's the only way to enter the draw for a chance to win a free giveaway. And finally, remember that you can also send me an audio message on the Speakpipe link, which is also in the show notes, so don't be a stranger. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click on to whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. And as always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next